Hi friends, it is Bess from Life with Bess and welcome to the Pattern Club tutorial for March's Pattern Club design Sunflower Cardi. The first thing we are going to do is prepare our hoop and fabric ready for sewing. I do have a detailed tutorial on how to do this in my embroidery basics series if you need a more step-by-step process. Next, it is time to transfer the design onto the fabric. I am using my iPad as a light box and will be tracing the design with my go-to Pilot Heat friction pen. Once your design has been completely transferred, you can choose to either start stitching straight away or swap the fabric around so the design is at the front of your hoop. That is totally just up to your preference. Once you have done this, make sure that you have all your DMC embroidery thread ready to go, and also make sure you grab a pair of embroidery scissors. You are ready to stitch. The first step is to stitch the base of the crocheted cardigan. We are going to be using detached buttonhole stitch for this, and I have a small stitch sampler design available if you want to practice it beforehand in the description. Using all 6 strands of the thread, start by back stitching the outline of the shape of the cardigan. There are going to be 5 main areas that we will be filling, so the 2 sleeves, the 2 front panels, and then the back panel. I kept my back stitches quite small as I wanted to make sure that my detached buttonhole stitch was tight enough to create a full coverage over the space. Make your way around the cardigan, outlining those main shapes. You will thank yourself later if you try and keep your stitches at an even length as well. We're going to start with this section on the left hand side, and so we're going to start with the chest section going from the top to the bottom, and then we'll be doing the sleeve from the bottom to the top. So to start our detached buttonhole stitch, create a foundation stitch across the space. Bring your needle up on that right hand side and then bring it across to the left, and then bring the needle back up through the fabric just beneath where you brought that stitch down. Hold the thread secure with your thumb and bring your needle down under the back stitch of the outline, underneath that foundation stitch and over the thread at the bottom. Pull that nice and tight, and then we're going to repeat. So bring your needle from the top of the space, under the back stitch of the outline, under the foundation stitch, but over the loose thread, and pull your thread the whole way through. We're going to repeat this for each of the stitches that we did along the top of the space until we reach the right hand side. You can start to see that these loops at the base of our stitches start to look a little bit like blanket stitch, and this will be the foundation for our second row. When we reach the end of that first row, do your final stitch into that last stitch of the outline, and then bring your needle back through the fabric in the same hole where your foundation stitch started. Then we're going to create the next foundation stitch by bringing your needle back up to the front, 1 back stitch down, and then moving it across to the left hand side. So you can start to see why having your back stitches down the side are just as important, as they help keep our rows an even distance apart. The main difference between that first row of stitches and the second row is that instead of starting our stitches with the outline, we're going to be using the base of the loop from the stitches in the previous row. So keep making your way across from the left to the right hand side of that section with stitches, and then prep the next row below with a foundation stitch. Just keep pulling those stitches nice and tight to create a nice full coverage. Now you can easily see that the shape is going to change a lot as we stitch, so we're going to need to either increase or decrease our stitches to be able to fill the space. Just like knitting or crochet, we'll do this by picking up or dropping a stitch. So in this case, I have been adding either a single stitch on one end or an extra stitch on both ends to increase the length of the area. The other trick that I did was to angle some of my foundation stitches slightly so that I could start to bring the angle of that right hand side of the cardigan down to be more horizontal. So for this row, the foundation stitch is still going all the way across, but it starts to overlap with the previous row on that left hand side. But as I went further down, I actually started to do only half rows of stitching instead of doing the foundation stitch all the way across. And then I just worked back to that right hand side, starting to fill in that little wedge of space with stitches. It was a little bit fiddly, but totally worth it for the end result, I think. You can start to see now that the rows are back to being pretty much almost horizontal, and I can then go back to doing my full length foundational stitches again. There wasn't a particular formula or pattern to it, it was just what felt right to fill the space. Now this stitch is called a detached stitch because the stitches actually connect with each other and don't attach into the fabric, so they're actually sitting loose on the top. So when we reach that last row, we are going to need to secure the stitches down. To finish with, bring your needle down through the loop, under the foundation stitch and under the back stitch outline at the bottom, and then over the loose thread. This just creates a nice clean finish to the bottom of the shape. This is our first section of the cardigan done. The trick will be to keep the same tension with all of the sections so that it has a continuous feel. Now it is time to stitch the sleeve, and like I said before, we want the stitches to go from the bottom to the top. So this time I recommend that you turn that hoop around. That means we're going to be using the same technique of actually stitching down. The steps are exactly the same. Create that foundation stitch across and then stitch back across to that right side using back stitches as a guide for the loops of the detached buttonhole stitch. By now you should be feeling pretty confident with this stitch and can move a little bit faster. As you are stitching along those edges where there already are stitches from the previous section, I will tell you that a pair of pliers will be very helpful to be able to pull the needle through the fabric easier. When you get to the tip of the sleeve, just keep decreasing your stitches to fill that shape and move the hoop around to wherever you need so that the angle feels more comfortable for you. You can see that as I'm pulling my stitches through, I'm really making sure that that thread is nice and tight. This just means that there'll be full coverage of the fabric in the background. Just keep repeating this exact same thing on the other side of the cardigan and then on that back piece as well, and then the hardest part of the design is all done. Now it is time to add in those fun little cardigan details, starting with the bottom of the sleeves. We're just going to finish them off by using some satin stitches that go vertically along the base. So using the pattern outline as a guide for your stitches, and then you're going to fill in the gaps to create a solid but slightly ribbed effect to the finish of the sleeves. Next, we're going to be adding some blanket stitch detail along the bottom of the cardigan. Obviously, we have now stitched over what we transferred from the pattern outline, but you can choose to wing it like I did or use your friction pen to mark the lines out again. If you aren't familiar with blanket stitch, there are heaps of great tutorials on YouTube that can walk you through it step by step. Just make sure that you keep your stitches an even width apart, and also make sure that the depth of your stitches are even as well. I just love that it adds that little line of yellow along the bottom of the detached buttonhole stitch that we did previously. Finish it off with just a single stitch back at the start so that it lines up perfectly, and then just repeat the blanket stitch on the other side. For the sunflowers, I recommend taking the time to mark at the position and size of the flowers from the pattern outline. It is really easy to just use your Pilot friction pen to sketch out on top of the previous stitching that we did. For the centers of the flowers, we'll be using our brown thread and then filling the space with seed stitch. It is only a very small area, so make sure that you keep your stitches small but overlapping to get really good coverage. It is a little bit tricky to stitch through all of the thread from the detached buttonhole stitch and the fabric, but just go slowly and carefully and make sure that you are really happy with the positions of each of your stitches. Now it is time to stitch the petals on the sunflowers. So we're going to be using two different shades of yellow and alternating them for the petals just to make sure there's a bit of extra texture and shading. Start by stitching the 8 spokes of the petals that we marked out in one of the yellow colors, and I found it good to stitch 2 straight stitches on top of each other just to create a nice solid tip. I then found it easier to stitch the spokes around first, all 8 of them, and then go back and fill in the petal detail later. To create that petal shape, I found that I only needed 1 extra stitch on each side of that center spoke to fill in the space, because we need to make sure that we leave space for the second round of petals that we'll be adding in that darker yellow color. And so when we add that second lot of petals, we're going to do exactly the same thing. Start by stitching the spokes in each of the gaps from the previous petals, and then go back around filling in the petal shapes. It will result in a very full, very happy sunflower, And remember, it doesn't need to be perfect at all. When you get near the edges of the cardigan where there's lots of thread overlapping, you might need a pair of pliers to just help pull the thread through that cardigan border. The final section that we need to stitch is the collar. So I chose to use chain stitch for this section so that it stands out from the cardigan itself, as it has a very different texture. Start with the lapel collar on the right hand side, so the one that goes underneath that top bit, and then starting at the bottom of the lapel collar, we're going to stitch a chain up to the top near the shoulder. Then we're going to bring our thread back down to the bottom and then repeat going to the top. This just means that all of our chains are going in the same direction. Once that right lapel is done, we're then going to move on to the left one. So I found it easiest to stitch those two sides of the space that were going to be filled with chain stitch first, and then just fill it by repeating those lines of chain stitch going from bottom to top until you have filled the space. When all of your stitching is done, it is time for those finishing touches. The first one being to erase any friction pen lines that are still visible, either using an iron, hairdryer, or like me, a hair straightener. Then you just back your hoop in your preferred way and you are done. Thank you so much for joining me for this pattern tutorial video. Make sure you subscribe for more stitchy tutorials, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and happy stitching.